which will be dedicated to devolution of legislative powers in regimes of territorial autonomy. I'm pleased to welcome you all. Perhaps some more will join, but because we have a tight program, I think it's good not to spend too much time on introductions or introductory remarks. Let me just say that this online seminar is organized at the initiative of the Permanent Mission of the Kingdom of Morocco in New York, and I'm pleased to thank them and welcome you all on their behalf. This seminar will be conducted both in English. The seminar will be conducted in English and French. So depending on your preference, you can click on the icon interpretation and choose your language. Actually, we'll have 5 presentations, 4 in English and only 1 in French by Dr. Karine David. So you can either navigate between the 2 languages or listen to the original. We'll have rather short presentations, but then each panelist has kindly contributed a more detailed, more substantive article, and these papers will be published by Morocco, so they will be made public, and they will be posted on our dedicated website of the International Academic Network for Autonomy. I will actually recall the link in the chat before the end of the seminar. Well, this research seminar is actually the 15th such seminar, and the second one online due to the persisting pandemic. This series of events was initiated by Morocco after Morocco introduced its initiative for the autonomy of the Sahara region to the United Nations Security Council in 2007. Since then, academics, experts from all over the world have addressed some aspects of autonomy regimes on all continents, such as the right to self-determination, democracy and human rights, institutions and mechanisms, natural resources, representation and legitimacy in negotiations, solidarity and equalization between regions, development models, human rights commissions, civil society and non-governmental organizations, external relations of autonomous regions, regionalization and territorial autonomy, models of territorial autonomy, autonomy as a means of settlement of conflicts, and last year, devolution of judicial powers. Now, these comparative studies addressed many cases of existing functioning autonomy throughout the world, such as Aceh in Indonesia, Spanish provinces, the islands of Azores and Madeira, Bangsamoro in the Philippines, Cameroon, the Caribbean island states, Eastern Malaysia, Greenland, Indian Northeast, Iraqi Kurdistan, Italian autonomous regions, Mexican states, New Caledonia, Newfoundland, and Nunavut in Canada, Nicaragua's Atlantic coast, Northern Ireland, Puerto Rico, Quebec, South Tyrol, Vojvodina, Wallonia, Zanzibar, etc. So as you can see, there are a large number of cases that we studied with contribution from all these experts, and all this was considered very useful to compare with the plan by Morocco about the autonomy, the west of the Sahara region. And as I said, all the proceedings of these previous seminars are available online on the website of the International Academic Network on Autonomy. Today, we'll focus on legislative powers and their devolution as an important aspect of regimes of territorial integrity or territorial autonomy. And our guest speakers will address the following cases and compare them with the Moroccan initiative for the Sahara region. First, we'll hear from Dr. Joan Josep Valbe, who's an associate professor at the University of Barcelona in Spain, who will focus on the case of the Canary Islands. Then Dr. Karine David, professor of law at the University of French Antilles in Guadeloupe, and she will speak about another island or archipelago, New Caledonia. Then Mr. George Farinas Fernos, who's associate professor at the School of Law, the University of Puerto Rico, who will talk about the status of Puerto Rico in the United States Commonwealth. And finally, Ms. Marie-Valérie Oupia, who is the head of the Faculty of Law and Management at the University of Mauritius, and she will deal with the island of Rodriguez, who also enjoys a large system of autonomy. At the end of those presentations, I will try to draw some conclusions or takeaways. Before giving the floor to the speakers, let me just briefly remind the main relevant provisions of the Moroccan initiative, which the Security Council in over a dozen resolutions qualified as, I quote, serious and credible, and which is endorsed by an increasing number of countries. Those countries indeed recognize both the importance of these initiatives as a means of political settlement of the ongoing dispute, and in the light of the efforts made by Morocco in terms of economic, social, cultural, environmental, and human development in that region. In 2008, Morocco adopted a policy of advanced regionalization aiming at promoting citizens' participation, democracy, and decentralization to facilitate economic, social, and cultural development, as well as modernization of state structures and improvement of local governance. The reform was then enshrined in the 2011 constitutional revision that adopted the principle of self-government for regions and granted them, among others, the main competency in terms of economic, social, cultural, and integrated sustainable development. This process established mechanisms for dialogue and consultation to involve citizens and NGOs in the elaboration and monitoring of development programs. Now, regarding more specifically legislative powers, the initiative for the Sahara region includes several provisions. Article 5, the Sahara populations will themselves run their affairs democratically through legislative, executive, and judicial bodies, enjoying exclusive powers. In Article 12, in keeping with democratic principles and procedures and acting through legislative, executive, and judicial bodies, the populations of the Sahara Autonomous Region shall exercise powers within the region's territorial boundaries, mainly over the following, and then comes a long list of areas where the regions will have full autonomy: local administration, local police force, jurisdictions, in the economic sector, budget and taxation, in the social sector, cultural affairs, the environment, etc. The parliament of the Sahara Autonomous Regions shall be made up of members elected by the various Sahrawi tribes and of members elected by direct universal suffrage by the region's population. There shall be adequate representation of women in the parliament of the region. Executive authority in the region shall lie with the head of government to be elected by the regional parliament. And that head of government shall be invested by the king. in Article 22, courts may be set up by the regional parliament to give rulings on disputes arising from enforcement of norms enacted by the competent bodies of the Sahara Autonomous Regions, and these courts shall give their rulings with complete independence in the name of the king. And finally, in Article 24, laws, regulations, and court rulings issued by bodies of the Sahara Autonomous Region shall be consistent with the region's autonomy statute and the kingdom's constitution. So as one can see, this regime of autonomy, once in place, will grant extensive powers for the autonomous region to exercise. Of course, as we will see, existing regimes in the world can go beyond such devolution, but most actually are less extensive, less generous. If the Moroccan initiative does not involve all the details of the autonomy governance system, it is because this plan remains to be negotiated with the relevant parties to the dispute and will necessarily be developed and complemented. So thank you for your attention, and I'm pleased to yield the floor to our speakers, and we'll start with Jean-Joël Balbé. I don't know if you have a PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, I do.
Yes, okay, so you can share your screen.
Okay, it seems that my ability to share is disabled.
Okay, so it will be restored shortly.
Okay. Okay. So thank you, Mark, and thank you and thanks everyone for being here. I'm going, since I will not go into all the details because as Mark said, every detail is in the written report. So I will speak about the case of Spain, and I will focus mostly on the case of the Canary Islands, and I will organize my presentation first explaining very general characteristics of the process of decentralization in legislative and political decentralization in Spain, and then I will devote a couple of slides explaining what are the legislative powers of the Canary Islands as a specific case. Although I must say that since the Spanish model has yielded or has produced more or less consistent and homogeneous system, what I will say about the Canary Islands can be applied to most of the autonomous regions in Spain. I will also focus on the third point on the functions of the main functions of the Canarian Parliament as the central actor of the legislative function in the region. And finally, I will just say a couple of things about the comparison between the Spanish case and the initiative for the autonomy of the Sahara region. So when in the middle of the 1970s, when the authoritarian system in Spain of Franco finished, Spain was a very centralized system. So the only layers with some kind of power were provinces and municipalities, and all this where they only had these units, they only had very just administrative duties. So although the history of or the tradition of having some decentralized autonomous communities or regions in the country had been tried in the 1930s with the Second Republic, it was not until 1978 in which this system just started off and actually finally developed. The main characteristics of the Spanish decentralization model is first, that it's an open-ended system. So the constitutional drafters didn't want or didn't opt for a closed system in which each region was assigned a limited number of competencies, but an open-ended system that is currently even now evolving. In general, the Constitution established a two-track system to become an autonomous region in Spain. The first one was thought for those historic nationalities that had already been autonomous during the experience of the Second Republic in the 1930s. And basically, they were Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Galicia, although Andalusia was also one of these regions that could apply to the fast track. And then these regions, they received from the outset in the early 1980s a full pack of competencies, and they became a fully fledged regional autonomous regions at once. Then the Constitution also established like a second track. We usually call it a slower track, although it is actually called the ordinary procedure, in which that was applied actually to most of the autonomous regions. In this slower track, regions received the first initial pack of 22 competencies. These were not minor competencies. These included urban planning, health system, economic development, environmental protection, things like that. They were basic and very important competencies, but they were just a limited number of them. And then after 5 years of experience with these initial competencies, these regions, if they wanted to, could reform their statutes of autonomy, and then they could be assigned a further number of competencies, like the fast-track regions. All in all, a total number of 19 autonomous communities were created since the beginning, although a couple of them were created a little bit later. But since the mid-80s, the number of autonomous communities has been fixed, and this has not changed. In general terms, what we can see through all this period is that although regions started off with very different levels of autonomy, at the end of the 2000s, or in 2020 or 2022, most regions have converged to the higher levels of autonomy. So, except with just some exceptions like the Basque Country or Navarra in fiscal terms, most regions in Spain have nowadays more or less the same level of autonomy. If we look at this graph, this graph represents the evolution of the depth of regional autonomy in Spain compared to the world's average, and we can see that in this in the line, the solid line representing the evolution in Spain, we can see that the decentralization model of Spain has evolved in 3 different waves. The first one is exactly in the early 1980s, in which the actual system is set up by the Constitution. Then in the 1990s, we see a first jump in the level of autonomy, the average level of autonomy. And this corresponds to the first wave of reforms of the statutes of autonomy. After the first 5 years of experience, those regions that were in the ordinary process opted for higher levels of autonomy. And then in the 2000s, in the first decade of the 2000s, we experienced more or less a similar model of statute reforms, although the changes were smaller, because they were all regions were reaching their maximum level of autonomy. Regarding the scope of the legislative power of regions in Spain, the Constitution, as I said before, established an open-ended system, but with some limits. So the Constitution drafters opted for creating 2 different lists. The first one was a list of those competencies that would be by the Constitution would be exclusive to the state, to the central state. And this included very relevant competencies such as foreign policy, defense, justice, labor, civil and commercial law, social security, public safety, customs and trade, currency, and immigration. But then the Constitution also established another list of competencies that would be exclusive or assigned to regions if they became autonomous. So, and this included, as I said before, urban planning, housing, public works, environment, social welfare, education, for instance, or health. One basic competency among these ones was that regions, when they became autonomous regions, they must create and organize their own self-government institutions, meaning an executive government, a legislative assembly, and a fully fledged public administration, with all the consequences that meet. So, and finally, the system actually was designed to protect eventually the power of the central state, in the sense that by the Constitution, the state can always approve framework legislation that is applicable to the whole territory, and it can also apply to those issues or competencies that are in the hands of the autonomous regions. Of course, this has produced and triggered a lot of conflicts of competencies, and this has increased the work of the Constitutional Court, as I will just comment on later. In general terms, all regions are organized in the same way, also by way of the Constitution. The drafters thought of regions as like mirroring systems, political systems that mirrored the Spanish government, the Spanish political system. So they were designed as parliamentary systems with strong executives. Basically, all regions must have regional parliaments, and these parliaments must be elected by universal suffrage of all eligible citizens within the region. These elections must follow a proportional representation system with the aim of representing all parts of the region's territory. The regional prime ministers must be elected by the regional parliament. They also will appoint the rest of the members of the executive. So although the executive as a whole is responsible before the parliament, its members are just appointed by the prime minister directly, and only the prime minister is actually elected by the regional parliament. And finally, regional assemblies elect just above 20% of the members of the Spanish Senate. So although the higher chamber was defined by the Constitution as a chamber of territorial representation, only one out of 5 senators are actually elected by the regional assemblies. So focusing more on the Canary Islands, so the model of the Canary Islands follows exactly the same model as most of Spanish regions, but the fact that the Canary Islands are an archipelago give them, and they are actually the furthest territory or the furthest autonomous region in Spain, they have some peculiarities. Regarding the nature of its legislative assembly, the Canary Islands approved their Statute of Autonomy, so they became a region in 1982, in the very early times of the decentralization process, and they experienced major reforms in 1996 and then in 2018. Its parliament is defined as the representative instrument of the Canarian people, and thus it is considered to be the central institution of the Canarian political system. Of course, their members are elected through universal suffrage, and it has 70 members, which in comparison with other regional parliaments in Spain is just a medium-sized parliament. The parliament serves 4 years, terms of 4 years, but elections, in the case of the Canary Islands, can be held in advance if the government, for instance, loses the confidence of the parliament. In some other regions, this is not possible. There are some regions in Spain which cannot hold elections in advance because their elections must coincide by law with elections to the municipal governments. So, as we can see, this is a more or less a very quite straightforward model of parliamentary democracy. The distinctiveness of the political system of the Canary Islands, as I said, comes more from the fact that it is an archipelago, because this produces a tension in the electoral system, a tension between proportionality, which is mandated by the Constitution, that all electoral systems for the regions must be proportional, and the territorial balance of its parts. Given the insularity nature of the Canary Islands, this has produced a number of problems. And those problems are reflected in the design of the electoral system and in its results. So the Canary Islands is divided in 2 different provinces, Las Palmas and Santa Cruz de Tenerife, but then it has 7 islands. 2 of them are considered the major islands, Gran Canaria and Tenerife, and then 5 minor islands, Fuerteventura, Lanzarote, La Palma, La Gomera, and El Hierro. The problem here is that the electoral system in the past considered each island an electoral district, and then by law it established a huge electoral barrier so that political parties could get representation. So before the reform of 2018, this barrier was of 30% of insular representation. So if a political party did not get 30% of votes in one island, they couldn't participate in a proportional assignment of seats. So in the reform of 2018, of course, this produced a huge overrepresentation of tiny political parties that were just strong in their own islands, and this produced a high fragmentation of the parliament and actually hindered the governance of the whole region. So in the last reform in 2018, the electoral barriers have been lowered. Now a political party must have either 15% of insular vote or 4% of regional vote in order to be counted and assigned some representation. And also this reform established 2 different votes to balance the system. And now, 61 members of parliament are elected through insular districts, and 9 members are elected through one single regional district. So this is a design that has the aim of trying to get some power from the insular parties and incentivize that some regional level parties get more represented. The main functions of the Canarian Parliament, first of all, is the legislative function, of course, in a parliamentary system. Although in this system, like the Spanish political system, gives the executive most power, and actually the executive drives most of legislative initiative. All the region's legislative action takes place in the plenary of the regional parliament, which gives it a central role in the whole process. The parliament in general can legislate on all competencies assigned to the region, with no direct controls from either the Spanish parliament or the Spanish government. All legislative function is then carried out with full autonomy, and only constitutional control of the legislation produced by parliaments is only carried out a posteriori, as I will comment just a little bit later. The second main function is the approval of the budget of the region. This is also a huge mechanism of control of the executive, as in regular parliamentary systems. So the budget must be approved through a law of the parliament, and then if the budget is not approved and then returned to the government, in practical terms, this means the loss of confidence, and then the executive should call for new elections. This has only happened twice in the history of the regional parliament in Spain, but still, it's a mechanism of executive control. The third main function, as I said, is the election of the regional prime minister. This is done after elections through an investiture vote among elected MPs. This is similar to the Spanish model, or the model for the central parliament in Spain, except that in the case of Spain, the prime minister does not need to be a member of parliament. The candidate to be prime minister needs an absolute majority of votes in a first round vote, but if she doesn't get it in the first round, then she will only need a plurality of votes in a second round. However, if in successive votes after 2 months no prime minister has been elected, then the parliament is automatically dissolved and new elections must be held. Finally, other functions that are relevant to the regional parliament of the Canary Islands is further mechanisms for the control of the executive, either through the classical confidence votes or motions of censure. In the case of Spain, motions of censure are constructive, which means that if another parliamentary group presents and holds a motion of censure, they must have an alternative and present an alternative and credible candidate to be prime minister. The election of representatives to the Spanish Senate, as I said, in particular, according to its population, the Canary Island can nominate and appoint 3 senators to the Spanish Senate. And finally, another main function of the parliament of all regions, and of course of the Canary Islands, is to refer legislation to the Constitutional Court if they consider that it conflicts with either the Constitution or the Statute of Autonomy of the region. These referrals, as I said, must be made a posteriori, so only once legislation has been approved and enacted and it has come to action. And secondly, decisions by the Constitutional Court regarding these referrals are binding for both the central state and the autonomous communities. So in this model, the Spanish constitutional drafters, they followed like the model of the federal arbiter model, in which the Constitutional Court is a referee that looks at both parts, and so that the pieces of legislation that can be referred to it can be either pieces of legislation produced by the central Legislative Assembly, so the Congreso de los Diputados in case of Spain, or by regional parliaments. And finally, as Monsieur Finot just read us before, the initiative for the autonomy of the Sahara region actually, in my opinion, reflects in principle that the aim that the Sahara region will have a power to legislate on several issues over which it will have some jurisdiction. This, of course, is very relevant to evaluate the depth of decentralization of the Sahara region when it comes. And although the document is, of course, by nature, a work in progress document, pending negotiations and all that, in my paper, I've made 4 general comments on things that I consider relevant to be considered in terms of the comparison between this and the case of the Canary Islands or Spain in general. The first one deals with the scope of the legislative powers. In its Article 12, the initiative outlines a number of policy areas which are very relevant, matters such as policy areas, on which the region will have power, like the organization of the local administration, budget, taxation, policy making, initiative, infrastructures, energy, transportation, and all that. If we compare that with the model that I just presented, then at least in the case of Spain, it is important to when this system is set up, to be able to outline the extent to which these powers will be exclusive to the region or shared with the central state, and perhaps the system of lists of competencies that are exclusive to both the central state and the region will be very helpful here. Sorry, I have a cold and I'm. The second issue deals with the election of the parliament, the members of the parliament, sorry. In its Article 19, the initiative reflects a commitment to the democratic election of the members of parliament, including references to the Sahrawi tribes and also an adequate representation of women. And here, I think that it is important to note, as I commented before, that in the design of the electoral system, further attention will have to be put on issues like districting, so district size, the way electoral thresholds are designed, and because these are the elements and that affect finally to the proportionality of the system, and obviously to the extent to which all sectors of society feel represented by a democratic assembly. Also, the mechanisms of gender representative equality, of course, will have to be considered, and the extent to which the region itself is able to regulate its own electoral system is also a very relevant point in those cases. The third point is to what extent the final text is able to reflect the balance between the executive and the legislative in the regional model, which is also a relevant point. And actually, Article 20 of the initiative points to what I think is just a very straightforward parliamentary model in which the prime minister, so the head of government, is elected by regional parliament, and this is really resemblant to the case that I just presented. Although more details will have to be given about or in a future text about who holds the legislative initiative and what mechanisms of checks and balances can be designed to establish the balance of power between the regional executive and the legislative powers. And finally, regarding the way that the system itself is able to ensure that all actors respect the whole model, in this spirit, I think Article 24 of the initiative affirms that all laws and regulations issued by the region, the autonomous region, will have to be consistent with the Statute of Autonomy and with the Kingdom's Constitution, of course. And in this case, as I commented, it is also very necessary to establish through which mechanisms decisions will be made about the conformity of regional legislation with the Kingdom's Constitution. This is very, very important to set up the rules of the game. And secondly, the mechanism to solve conflicts of competency between the central state and the region is also the second relevant point in this. Sorry, I will stop here because my voice is waned, and I think that I've used all my time. Thank you very much, and I will answer to any questions you may have. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jean-Joseph. It's a very extensive presentation, and you're right to mention some lack of precision, lack of detail. As I said, this is done on purpose. It's left to the negotiators, but the points you raise are quite legitimate, and I'm sure they will be carefully noted. Also, just as a reminder, you mentioned the Autonomy Index. Maybe out of humility, you didn't mention that you invented this index, and you explained it in last year's presentation. So anybody interested would be welcome to join to look up your presentation of your article of last year, which is available on our website. So thank you so much. Now we move to Dr. Karine David, who's also an expert on autonomous regimes, and she now teaches in the French Antilles, West Indies, but she also lived in New Caledonia and studied the autonomous region of Caledonia throughout its historical development. And so I'm pleased to give her the floor now. Karine.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Finot. Bonjour à tous. Alors, je vais être la seule à intervenir en français. Je vous remercie. Je remercie tout d'abord effectivement Monsieur Finot pour m'avoir convié une nouvelle fois, 10 ans après ma première intervention dans le cadre de cette initiative de mise en place d'un réseau sur les territoires autonomes. Donc effectivement, je vais intervenir sur la Nouvelle-Calédonie qui présente un certain nombre de spécificités. Alors je vais tenter de partager mon écran. Voilà. J'espère que c'est bon. Donc voilà, moi je vais vous parler effectivement de la dévolution du pouvoir législatif en Nouvelle-Calédonie. Donc la Nouvelle-Calédonie, qui est une colonie française depuis la moitié du 19e siècle, date de sa prise de possession par la France. Donc la Nouvelle-Calédonie, pour ceux qui ne connaîtraient pas, est un archipel situé dans le sud de l'océan Pacifique, à l'est de l'Australie. Alors, la Nouvelle-Calédonie est finalement un territoire ou une société qu'on appelle une société divisée. Je vous ai mis là, en fait, qui démontre bien le problème principal de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, c'est qu'on a en fait une population qui est divisée à la fois sur une base ethnique, mais aussi sur une base politique, c'est-à-dire que on a une société divisée. D'un côté, le peuple premier, les Kanaks, qui sont la population autochtone mélanésienne, dont la très grande majorité de la population est favorable à l'indépendance. Et vous voyez en bleu sur cette carte que les endroits où les Mélanésiens, les Kanaks sont majoritaires, sont les endroits qui ont, on va le voir, voté majoritairement pour le référendum d'indépendance en faveur de l'indépendance. Et de l'autre côté, on les voit par ailleurs en rouge. Eh bien, en fait, on a finalement des populations qui descendent des anciens colons et des anciens bagnards, mais aussi une main-d'œuvre à la fois asiatique et océanienne qui a immigré depuis un peu plus d'un siècle et demi sur ce territoire. Alors, l'architecture institutionnelle actuelle de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, elle date en fait de 1998 et d'un accord, l'accord de Nouméa, qui finalement est le résultat d'une évolution statutaire graduelle qui a eu lieu depuis la fin de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, où la Nouvelle-Calédonie est devenue un territoire d'outre-mer, et surtout depuis 1956, où la Nouvelle-Calédonie a bénéficié d'un statut d'autonomie assez important, hein, c'est ce qu'on appelle la loi cadre de fer, mais où, à partir de cette forte autonomie de 1956, hein, où il y a eu des transferts massifs de compétences, mais pas de pouvoir législatif, hein, la dévolution d'un pouvoir législatif en Nouvelle-Calédonie est assez récente, puisqu'elle date de 1998. On a eu, entre 1956 et 1988, hein, pendant une trentaine d'années, plus de 10 statuts, donc plus de 10 organisations institutionnelles différentes qui se sont succédées pour répondre à une radicalisation de la revendication indépendantiste de la part de la population mélanésienne. Et donc, progressivement, s'est construit finalement le statut actuel de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, qui est finalement caractérisé par des pouvoirs normatifs importants, on aura l'occasion d'y revenir, mais également un fédéralisme interne. Fédéralisme interne qui vient répondre finalement à, on va le voir, la répartition de la population sur le territoire. Fédéralisme interne qui trouve sa source pour la première fois en 1984 et qui a été réitéré dans les statuts suivants, jusqu'au statut actuel et donc jusqu'à la provincialisation, puisqu'on va le voir, la Nouvelle-Calédonie est divisée en 3 provinces qui sont un échelon finalement politique extrêmement stratégique et important dans l'organisation de la Nouvelle-Calédonie. Et puis, autre caractéristique importante qui date de 1998 et qui va nous occuper aujourd'hui particulièrement, c'est le pouvoir législatif qui a été accordé à la Nouvelle-Calédonie et un gouvernement très original en Nouvelle-Calédonie, un gouvernement multiparti, c'est-à-dire dans lequel siègent à la fois majorité et opposition, ce qui signifie en Nouvelle-Calédonie, dans lequel siègent à la fois autonomistes et indépendantistes, donc siègent à la fois les partis politiques favorables au maintien dans la France et ceux qui souhaitent l'accession à la souveraineté. Alors, vous l'aurez compris, hein, toute l'architecture institutionnelle et l'histoire de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, l'histoire contemporaine, en fait, répond à un cadre d'émancipation progressive, la Nouvelle-Calédonie étant inscrite sur la liste des territoires non autonomes à décoloniser de l'ONU. Et donc, c'est assez logiquement hein, que le statut actuel qui a démarré donc, en 1998 devait se clore par une série de référendums à l'issue desquels, effectivement, soit la Nouvelle-Calédonie devenait indépendante, soit elle restait française. Alors, on a eu 3 référendums en 2018, en 2020 et en 2021. Alors, la difficulté aujourd'hui, hein, vous voyez que la répartition des voix était assez partagée, mais sur les 2 premiers référendums, il y a eu une difficulté sur laquelle je n'insisterai pas aujourd'hui parce que ce n'est pas l'objet. Lors du 3e référendum, suite à un désaccord en fait, sur la date d'organisation du référendum, les indépendantistes n'ont pas souhaité participer au référendum, mais on voit que sur les 2 premiers référendums, effectivement, on avait un partage des voix. Alors aujourd'hui, la Nouvelle-Calédonie, les partis politiques calédoniens sont en discussion pour la mise en place d'un nouveau statut, mais la comparaison reste de toute façon tout à fait opportune puisque la dévolution d'un pouvoir législatif dans le cadre du futur statut de la Nouvelle-Calédonie n'est absolument pas discutée. C'est un outil qui a été créé il y a 20 ans et qui aujourd'hui a fait ses preuves et personne ne se pose la question de ne pas réitérer cette dévolution du pouvoir législatif. Alors, l'organisation institutionnelle de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, je vous le disais, elle repose, et vous allez voir que c'est important, c'est pour ça que j'insiste un peu, Elle repose donc sur la division du territoire en 3 provinces, la province des îles, la province nord, la province sud. À côté de ça, au niveau de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, on a donc un congrès de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, qui est le Parlement, l'Assemblée parlementaire locale. On a un gouvernement de la Nouvelle-Calédonie. On a également un Sénat coutumier. C'est la particularité un peu de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, le Sénat coutumier qui représente en fait la coutume kanak dans un certain nombre de décisions et qui, vous le verrez, de manière marginale, intervient dans le processus législatif en Nouvelle-Calédonie. Et puis, on a évidemment le représentant de l'État, le haut-commissaire de la République, qui exerce le contrôle de légalité et un certain nombre de compétences qui sont toujours de la compétence de l'État. Alors, ce qu'il faut bien comprendre, c'est que, contrairement à l'Espagne, la dévolution d'un pouvoir législatif à une collectivité territoriale est quelque chose d'extraordinaire, parce que, comme le Maroc, la France est un État unitaire. Et un État unitaire, dans le cadre d'un État dit unitaire et non pas régional, effectivement, la dévolution d'un pouvoir législatif à une collectivité territoriale n'est normalement pas envisageable. Donc, le Congrès de la Nouvelle-Calédonie est le seul parlement local à proprement parler dans le système juridique français, c'est-à-dire que le Congrès de la Nouvelle-Calédonie est la seule assemblée locale à être dotée finalement d'un pouvoir législatif. Alors, ce congrès de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, il présente un certain nombre d'originalités, on va le voir. Alors, notamment, s'agissant de la désignation des membres du congrès. Et cette originalité, elle est, on va dire, elle peut être caractérisée de plusieurs manières. L'élection se passe en fait dans le cadre des élections provinciales, c'est-à-dire que ce sont les élections aux assemblées de province, puisque chaque province est dotée d'une assemblée. Ce sont les élections provinciales qui servent de support à la désignation des membres du Congrès, ce qui signifie qu'en réalité, on a 3 circonscriptions qui sont les 3 provinces pour l'élection au Congrès. C'est la même finalement contrainte et le même objectif, qui est de caractériser une meilleure représentativité ou optimiser en tout cas la représentativité de la population. Alors, en quoi quelles sont finalement les originalités là-dedans? Alors, je précise par rapport à notamment la proposition marocaine pour le Sahara occidental, et ça c'est une reprise du système français, l'élection des membres du Congrès est soumise en fait à une parité homme-femme stricte, dans le sens où les listes de candidats, puisqu'on est sur un scrutin de liste à la représentation proportionnelle, les listes de candidats doivent respecter une stricte alternance entre les représentants des 2 sexes. Mais finalement, l'originalité de l'élection ne se trouve pas là. Elle se trouve d'une part dans le cadre du corps électoral qui est admis à participer à l'élection. Et ça, c'est une vraie problématique qu'on retrouve dans beaucoup de territoires autonomes. Alors, c'est un corps électoral qui est extrêmement complexe, mais pour le faire le plus simplement possible, on peut dire que toute personne qui est venue s'installer en Nouvelle-Calédonie après 1998, d'accord, après 1998, c'est-à-dire après la signature de l'accord de Nouméa, qui est le support de l'architecture institutionnelle aujourd'hui, n'a pas le droit de voter à cette élection. Ce qui veut dire qu'aujourd'hui, on a des personnes qui résident en Nouvelle-Calédonie depuis plus de 20 ans et qui n'ont pas le droit de participer à cette élection. Alors, c'est évidemment un gros point d'achoppement pour les discussions à venir dans la mise en place du nouveau statut. Aujourd'hui, on compte à peu près 270 000 habitants en Nouvelle-Calédonie, un corps électoral d'environ 220 000 personnes. Pour vous donner une idée, cette mesure exclut du corps électoral provincial environ 50 000 personnes. Donc, c'est quand même une exclusion qui est assez substantielle et qui ne perdurera certainement pas puisqu'elle est contraire à la Convention européenne des droits de l'homme. Alors, c'est une mesure qui a été mise en place, évidemment, pour favoriser, en réalité, une meilleure représentativité des électeurs kanak et donc du peuple premier. Hein, c'est l'équilibre politique qui a été trouvé dans les négociations. Et cette surreprésentation en fait, du corps finalement électoral kanak, elle est finalement renforcée par une autre mesure, puisque d'une part, on exclut un certain nombre de finalement électeurs qui seraient plutôt favorables aux partis politiques loyalistes, et on exclut également, on va aussi surreprésenter la population mélanésienne au Congrès par la répartition qui est faite au Congrès. Je vous l'ai dit, hein, les circonscriptions électorales, elles sont provinciales, et comme vous le voyez, vous avez en fait 54 membres au Congrès de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, et donc vous en avez 15 issus de la province Nord, 32 issus de la province Sud, 7 issus de la province des îles. Alors j'ai essayé, pour vous montrer la surreprésentation, j'ai essayé de schématiser ça. Et quand on schématise ça, vous voyez qu'ici, si on n'avait pas de surreprésentation, en réalité, les électeurs de la province Sud, qui sont très majoritairement pour le maintien de la Nouvelle-Calédonie dans la France, représenteraient à peu près 3/4 des sièges. Or, aujourd'hui, ils en représentent à peine 2/3. D'accord ? Donc, on a effectivement donc, une surreprésentation de la population mélanésienne dans le cadre des élections. C'est un gros point d'achoppement des discussions à l'heure actuelle. Ce n'est pas certain que ce sera maintenu, en tout cas pas dans ces proportions-là, dans le cadre du prochain statut. Alors, au-delà de cette originalité importante hein, du Congrès, je voulais aussi vous parler du Congrès le situer dans le cadre de l'architecture institutionnelle, parce que ça me semble important. Et là, on voit très bien que le système politique qui a été mis en place en Nouvelle-Calédonie est un système politique parlementaire, avec un congrès qui joue véritablement le rôle d'un parlement en régime parlementaire, et qui, finalement, un territoire qui est doté d'une structure étatique, et qui relève plus d'une structure étatique que d'une structure d'une collectivité territoriale. Alors, bien sûr, on reviendra sur l'exercice du pouvoir législatif, mais ce qu'il faut voir également, c'est que le Congrès de la Nouvelle-Calédonie a plusieurs rôles, et ça rejoint, on peut faire des parallèles avec ce qui est proposé pour le Maroc. Le Congrès de la Nouvelle-Calédonie désigne, alors non pas comme c'est prévu au Maroc, le chef de l'exécutif, mais l'ensemble des membres de l'exécutif. C'est-à-dire que pour le Sahara occidental, il est proposé effectivement donc, que l'Assemblée désigne le Premier ministre, en quelque sorte, et que le Premier ministre ensuite forme son gouvernement. Ici, en réalité, c'est le Congrès qui désigne l'ensemble des membres du gouvernement. Et comme je le disais, l'originalité, hein, je crois qu'on retrouve ça uniquement aujourd'hui en Irlande du Nord. L'originalité, c'est que c'est une désignation à la représentation proportionnelle, ce qui fait que siègent au gouvernement à la fois des représentants politiques loyalistes favorables au maintien de la Nouvelle-Calédonie dans la France, et des représentants indépendantistes qui doivent travailler ensemble pour prendre des décisions possiblement par consensus, et s'ils n'y arrivent pas, à la majorité. Et puis, au-delà de ça, hein, le Congrès de la Nouvelle-Calédonie donc, peut mettre en place des commissions d'enquête pour contrôler l'action du gouvernement local. Gouvernement local, hein, donc, qui va pouvoir éventuellement donc, faire l'objet de ces commissions d'enquête. C'est un mécanisme qui est très peu utilisé. Hein, il a été utilisé une seule fois depuis 1999. Et enfin, comme aux Canaries, hein, il y a possibilité d'une motion de censure, pas constructive pour le coup. C'est-à-dire que on va effectivement donc le Congrès peut renverser le gouvernement, mais on n'a pas besoin effectivement de proposer en amont une nouvelle composition d'un gouvernement. C'est une élection qui aura lieu ensuite. C'est un mécanisme qui n'a jamais été utilisé depuis 1999, probablement dû au fait que le gouvernement étant composé à la représentation proportionnelle, ça neutralise le mécanisme. Notons également qu'il n'y a pas de parallélisme, on va dire, dans le cadre d'un système parlementaire, c'est-à-dire que si le Congrès peut renverser le gouvernement par le vote d'une motion de censure, le gouvernement ne peut pas dissoudre l'Assemblée. Seul le gouvernement français peut, en cas de dysfonctionnement du Congrès, en cas d'impossibilité de fonctionnement du Congrès parce qu'il y aurait un blocage politique, seul le gouvernement français est susceptible de dissoudre l'Assemblée, cela n'est jamais arrivé, malgré le fait qu'il y a eu des blocages. Le gouvernement français n'est jamais intervenu et a laissé les élus locaux sortir de leur conflit sans intervenir. Donc voilà. Donc en gros, on voit bien qu'effectivement le Congrès donc, est au centre finalement du système politique calédonien. Et il est doté, donc, comme je le disais, originalité dans le système français, il est doté d'un pouvoir législatif. Donc, comme je vous le précisais, c'est une originalité parce que, bien évidemment, la France étant un État unitaire assez conservateur en termes sur les questions de décentralisation, il a pendant longtemps pas été envisagé cette possibilité d'un pouvoir législatif, de la dévolution d'un pouvoir législatif à une assemblée locale. C'est le cas donc depuis 1998 et malgré des demandes répétées d'autres collectivités ultramarines, l'État français n'a pas souhaité doter d'autres collectivités d'un pouvoir législatif. Et on va voir assez rapidement, puisque effectivement je renvoie à mon papier écrit pour plus de précision, on va voir assez rapidement donc, le domaine d'intervention de la loi du pays, la procédure législative, ainsi que les modalités de contrôle de ces lois du pays. Donc, loi du pays, qui est le nom qui a été donné à ce pouvoir législatif local pour le distancier un peu de la loi nationale. Alors, ce qu'il faut bien comprendre avant peut-être, ce qu'il faut préciser avant peut-être de rentrer dans le domaine matériel de la loi du pays, c'est que la loi du pays calédonienne est dans la hiérarchie des normes exactement au même niveau que la loi nationale. C'est-à-dire que il n'y a pas de relation hiérarchique entre le pouvoir législatif national et le pouvoir législatif local. La distinction se fait finalement par le domaine matériel d'intervention. Alors, la loi du pays intervient dans un nombre important de domaines, dans le cadre d'un partage de compétences qui est organisé d'une part entre l'État français, qui conserve un certain nombre de compétences. Je pense à la défense nationale, je pense à la monnaie, par exemple, aux garanties des libertés fondamentales, mais aussi à des compétences peut-être moins stratégiques ou jugées moins importantes, comme l'enseignement supérieur ou la recherche. Donc, l'État français qui conserve un certain nombre de compétences, qu'on dit régaliennes, mais pas nécessairement, puisque la Nouvelle-Calédonie, par exemple, dispose du pouvoir fiscal. La Nouvelle-Calédonie et les provinces qui disposent aussi d'un certain nombre de compétences, mais les provinces, les assemblées de province, elles n'ont pas un pouvoir législatif. Alors, la Nouvelle-Calédonie, l'originalité du Congrès de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, c'est qu'il adopte en fait à la fois des actes de nature réglementaire et des actes de nature législative en fonction des domaines de compétences dans lesquels il intervient. C'est-à-dire que ce sur quoi je veux insister, c'est que quand je vais vous donner un peu les domaines dans lesquels intervient le Congrès de la Nouvelle-Calédonie par la voie législative, donc par les lois du pays, en fait, ça n'est pas révélateur de l'ensemble des pouvoirs, l'ensemble des compétences dans lesquelles intervient le Congrès, puisque la loi organique statutaire énumère plus de 35 domaines de compétences pour la Nouvelle-Calédonie. Et parmi ces domaines-là, seule une douzaine relèvent de la loi. Par exemple, on parlait tout à l'heure du budget. La Nouvelle-Calédonie est compétente pour adopter son propre budget, mais elle l'adopte non pas par la loi, mais par la voie réglementaire. Donc, lorsque le Congrès de la Nouvelle-Calédonie doit intervenir, il doit d'abord déterminer si c'est par la voie réglementaire ou par la voie législative. Alors, c'est quelque chose qui est relativement lourd, qui est en réalité une réminiscence des statuts antérieurs et qui devrait, a priori, être modifié dans le cadre du futur statut de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, où l'ensemble des compétences exercées par le Congrès devrait relever de la loi du pays, donc du pouvoir législatif. Alors, très rapidement, parce qu'on ne va pas lister tout, évidemment, je renvoie à mon papier pour les domaines, mais il y a deux principaux domaines d'intervention qui regroupent à eux deux 80% des lois du pays qui sont intervenues depuis 1999, soit environ 250 lois du pays. 40% interviennent en matière fiscale et douanière. et 40 autres % interviennent en matière de droit du travail, de droit syndical et de droit de la sécurité sociale. Donc ça, ce sont vraiment les 2 gros champs d'intervention matériels de la loi du pays. Ensuite, alors j'en ai listé quelques-uns ici, mais il y en a d'autres. Hein. Ceux qui sont peut-être notables, hein, c'est que effectivement, la Nouvelle-Calédonie exerce des compétences comme le droit civil ou le droit commercial, par exemple. Donc elle intervient également en matière de propriété privée, en matière de propriété coutumière, puisque c'est un régime foncier spécifique en Nouvelle-Calédonie. Elle intervient également en matière, par exemple, d'hydrocarbures et de nickel, hein, puisque la Nouvelle-Calédonie a énormément de ressources naturelles en matière de nickel. Et la loi du pays intervient également en matière de signes identitaires. Hein. Par exemple, la Nouvelle-Calédonie a adopté sa devise terre de parole, terre de partage par la voie législative. Et puis, il y a, si ça vous intéresse, dans mon papier, vous verrez qu'il y a d'autres domaines d'intervention qui relèvent de la loi du pays. Alors, du point de vue de la procédure, pardon, hein, les grandes lignes de la procédure ont été fixées par le Parlement français dans le cadre de la loi organique statutaire et ont été finalement déclinées ensuite par son règlement intérieur, par le Congrès de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, mais les grandes lignes de la procédure ont été fixées par l'État. L'initiative des lois appartient à la fois à l'exécutif local, le gouvernement, et également aux membres du Congrès. L'État n'a aucune initiative, hein, n'intervient pas dans l'exercice des compétences locales. Le principe, c'est que l'État, dès lors qu'il transfère une compétence, alors en Nouvelle-Calédonie, il y a une irréversibilité des transferts de compétences garantis par la Constitution, et un transfert de compétences signifie un dessaisissement de l'État au regard de l'exercice de la compétence. Donc l'initiative, elle appartient concurremment donc, au Congrès de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, aux membres du Congrès et aux membres du gouvernement, avec simplement une intervention en amont de l'examen de la loi du pays par le Conseil d'État, donc qui est une instance de niveau national, qui va rendre un avis sur la constitutionnalité et la conventionnalité de la loi du pays. C'est un avis facultatif, c'est un avis dont les effets sont facultatifs, c'est-à-dire que le Congrès peut s'affranchir des remarques qui sont faites par le Conseil d'État, sauf à risquer évidemment une saisine du Conseil constitutionnel s'il y avait un problème de constitutionnalité de la loi. Mais comme aux Canaries, j'ai l'impression, hein, la loi est soumise simplement donc, évidemment au droit international, au droit constitutionnel et à la loi organique statutaire, mais n'est évidemment pas soumis aux lois adoptées au niveau national. Pardon. Sinon, la procédure, c'est une procédure assez classique, si ce n'est, et je voulais le préciser, qu'on a en fait un bicamérisme partiel des lois du pays lorsqu'elles interviennent en matière d'identité kanak, c'est-à-dire en gros lorsqu'elles interviennent en matière coutumière, pour régir notamment la propriété foncière coutumière ou ces éléments-là, ou le statut civil coutumier des populations kanak. Dans ce cadre-là, en fait, on n'a plus un monocamérisme, mais le Congrès va intervenir dans le cadre d'un bicamérisme uniquement dans ces matières, où vous avez une navette assez classique qui est organisée avec le Sénat coutumier. Sénat coutumier, juste rapidement, c'est une assemblée qui est composée de 16 sénateurs coutumiers qui sont en fait désignés à raison de 2 par aire coutumière. Hein. Je vous ai mis un peu la carte là pour montrer. Donc 16 sénateurs coutumiers qui vont effectivement donc, intervenir dans le cadre de la navette, sachant que c'est une navette qui est inégalitaire puisque le Congrès a le dernier mot en cas de désaccord entre les deux chambres. Voilà. Sinon, on est sur une procédure législative très, très classique pour un Parlement monocaméral. Bon, je ne m'attarde pas sur la procédure. J'ai mis le schéma là, il est également dans mon papier. Pour terminer, pour ne pas trop déborder sur le temps qui m'a été attribué, s'agissant du contrôle des lois du pays, les lois du pays peuvent simplement faire l'objet d'un contrôle de constitutionnalité de la part du Conseil constitutionnel qui existe au niveau national, donc le Conseil constitutionnel français, qui est d'ailleurs, hein, ce contrôle par le Conseil constitutionnel est vraiment le symbole de la nature législative des lois du pays, puisqu'elles sont les seules normes locales à être contrôlées par le Conseil constitutionnel. Très rapidement, hein, ce contrôle peut être opéré selon 2 procédures. une procédure classique dite a priori, c'est-à-dire qu'une fois le texte adopté, certaines autorités politiques, dont le représentant de l'État et le gouvernement ou des élus locaux, peuvent saisir le Conseil constitutionnel avant la promulgation du texte, c'est-à-dire après adoption, mais avant promulgation. Si le Conseil constitutionnel considère que certaines dispositions sont non conformes à la Constitution, il va les censurer. Et la loi du pays sera promulguée en étant amputée de ces dispositions législatives. La deuxième possibilité qui existe que depuis 2010, mais parce qu'elle n'existe pour les lois nationales que depuis 2010 également, c'est ce qu'on appelle en France la question prioritaire de constitutionnalité, qui est un contrôle a posteriori assez classique, selon le modèle américain, où dans le cadre d'un procès, un justiciable peut soulever l'inconstitutionnalité d'une disposition. Et alors, finalement, le procès sera à ce moment-là arrêté pour que la question soit posée au Conseil constitutionnel et le procès reprendra en fonction de la réponse qui a été donnée par le Conseil constitutionnel. Soit il aura censuré la disposition et le juge devra juger sans cette disposition, soit le Conseil constitutionnel aura déclaré la disposition conforme, et alors à ce moment-là, le juge pourra juger au regard de la disposition législative contestée. Voilà ce que je pouvais dire. Alors évidemment, je reste prête à répondre à toutes les questions qui pourraient être posées, mais vous le voyez, on intervient quand même dans un contexte assez particulier. Les représentants politiques locaux doivent, dans les prochains mois, trouver une solution pour mettre en place un nouveau statut. Comme je vous le disais au départ, ce qui est sûr, c'est que personne ne remet en cause l'existence d'une assemblée dotée d'un pouvoir législatif local. Donc, les lois du pays perdureront au-delà, effectivement, de ce statut qui a vu l'adoption de un peu plus de 250 lois du pays. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Un grand merci à vous, Karine, pour cette présentation très détaillée d'un système a priori complexe, mais qui est le résultat de toute cette évolution historique, mais qui est encore en développement, en devenir. Mais merci d'avoir bien marqué la centralité et l'importance des pouvoirs législatifs. Now we move to another island or archipelago in another ocean, Puerto Rico. And I'm pleased to give the floor to George Farinacci-Fernos, who will explain how the devolution of legislative powers is applied in the case of Puerto Rico. George, floor is yours.
Okay. Is the PowerPoint on and can you hear me? Perfect. Thank you very much. For some reason, I can still see this. Oh. So I will be sharing with you some thoughts regarding Puerto Rico's current situation and its relationship with the United States, in particular in the context of the exercise of its legislative powers over local issues. And the structure will be very similar to the two previous speakers, which is that first, we need to address some general elements of how the US constitutional structure works and the general relationship between the central or federal government in the United States and those of the individual state and territories, which are the two main components of the US Federation in the context of the exercise of legislative powers. Once we have the general structure established, we can go more specifically into what has been Puerto Rico's historic relationship with the United States, both in terms of the relationship itself and to the particular issue of the exercise of legislative powers. And we are going to analyze two main moments of that relationship and the issue of legislative powers. Historically, from 1952, which is the date of the current local charter, and 2016, which saw a substantial intervention by the federal Congress regarding Puerto Rico's legislative powers, and what lessons can we extract from those experiences in, obviously, particularly the context of the content of the initiative that we have been discussing today. And as we will see during the presentation, there will be some contrast with the most important elements of the initiative. And at the end of the presentation, I will make some specific and direct remarks regarding the initiative. First, very simple conceptual notes, because I will be using the terminology of US domestic constitutional law and see how it fits to our overall discussion. So Puerto Rico is what, and I'm going to much more detail, is considered and is characterized legally under US domestic constitutional law as an unincorporated territory of the United States. Another thing that we have to keep in mind is that the terminology that it's used in US law regarding legislative powers distinguishes between two types of powers. One is what's called technically the police power. And the basic translation in general language would be general legislative powers. The idea that you can address any type of issue, whether the traffic laws or environmental laws or whatever general power we normally associate with a general legislature, that's called the police power. In contrast with the notion of a limited legislature that only possesses specific types of power and does not possess, therefore, the more general police power. And with that in mind, let's go and have a general background and discussion of what's the current US constitutional structure as it relates to this point. Well, we start with an obvious fact. The United States is a federal republic, and therefore it has two spheres of power. One is the federal government, which includes federal enclaves, and the constituent parts, which are mostly the federated states, the 50 states of the United States, and the territories that belong to the United States. I am excluding former analysis because it is a separate issue, but it's worth mentioning what the US Constitution describes as the Indian tribes, the Native American tribes, and the District of Columbia, which is the seat of government of the federal government. So the legislative power, as a general matter, is divided between the federal government and the states. We should remind ourselves that the United States is not a parliamentary system. It is a tripartite separation of power system with the executive, judicial, and legislative powers, each having co-equal powers. We obviously are going to focus on Congress as the wielder of legislative power. The federal Congress of the United States does not possess general legislative powers, what we have dubbed the police power. In fact, that police power is exercised by legislatures. So the main view is Congress cannot do anything unless it's authorized to do so, while the state legislatures can do anything as long as they are not authorized to do so. So the default position is that Congress does not have a particular power, and the default position is that state legislatures do have the particular legislative power. So therefore, the federal Congress only possesses what's called delegated power, delegated by the federal Constitution. And there are three main sets of delegated powers. The specific ones, which are enumerated in Article 1 of the US Constitution, which includes, for example, power over the currency, the war powers, bankruptcies, a specific set of powers. A more limited set of incidental powers that are related to those enumerated powers, and some inherent powers to national sovereignty, for example, control over the borders of the United States. That's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, but it's considered inherent to the idea that it's an independent nation. If a congressional statute is not derived from one of these sources, that statute is invalid. Example from US constitutional law several years ago, the US Congress attempted to ban an individual from carrying handguns near a school, and the US Supreme Court found that unconstitutional because the Congress lacked the power to regulate over that area, because since it does not possess the general police power, it has to point to a specific enumerated power that authorizes the exercise of that particular statute. Now, during the 20th century, as the United States became a more integrated country, there was a considerable expansion of one of the powers granted by the Constitution to Congress, which is the power to regulate commerce. And the US Supreme Court has interpreted that as this massive authority to regulate areas that have impact over the national economy of the United States. That's why, in a rough estimation, more than 90% of current US laws derive from a single source, which is the power to regulate commerce. And this explains a whole wide set of federal statutes, environmental regulations, labor relations, the transportation, even all aspects of economic activity. They all flow from the singular grant of power to the federal Congress, which is the power to regulate commerce. Now, even though there has been this considerable expansion of what can be done under the Commerce Clause, the point remains that there are still issues Congress cannot legislate over because it is not considered to be within the enumerated powers, even the broadly defined commerce power. That is why there is no national federal statute regarding divorce in the United States, because Congress lacks that power. That is an issue that's left exclusively to each one of the state or territorial legislatures. Congress, for example, cannot pass laws that impact or have to do with non-economic local matters. So we have an interesting Venn diagram here, right? There are issues where the federal Congress has exclusive powers, the currency, war powers. There are issues where the state legislatures have exclusive power, family relations, and there's this middle ground where both legislative spheres have authority to regulate. And in those instances, there's going to be overlap. So there is no absolute separation of legislative power that the federal Congress has these things and the state legislature has these things. No, there's three separate spheres: exclusive state competency, exclusive federal competency, and a considerable area of overlap. How does that overlap work? Well, the default position is that they work concurrently and that they are going to be harmonious, and therefore there's an obligation to follow and obey both federal law and state law. I'll give you an example. Federal law says that no worker can work more than 40 hours a week. Well, some states say no more than 8 hours a day. What do employers do? They have to follow both statutes. They have to follow the federal statute and the state statute. But there are instances in where one has to give way to the other, where the harmony and the concurrence cannot occur. And when there is a clash, there's a clause in the US Constitution referred to as the Supremacy Clause, which states that if there is a conflict, federal law trumps state law. And there are three ways that this could happen under US constitutional law. One, where the federal Congress explicitly states that it wants to set aside state regulations. Two, when there is a very complex federal statute and scheme that does not allow for the existence of dual state regulation, and physical impossibility, right? That there is a physical contradiction between what the federal law requires and what the state law requires. And in order to obey one, you would necessarily need to violate the other one. And if that's so, then federal law will trump state law. Now, states, so this is interesting, right? Remember, Congress does not have the police power. does not have general police powers, but it does have a considerable authority under the commerce power, which means simply that it has a power over economic issues. States, on the other hand, have the general police power, but they do not have power to directly regulate what's called interstate commerce, right? Economic activity that is that pertains to the entire United States. Yet states can have impact over issues of commerce if they do it incidentally. So if a state legislature could, for example, set the minimum drinking age or requirement of having seatbelts in the car, that will have an impact on commerce, but it's considered an incidental impact on commerce because it's still an exercise of the general police power, the power to protect the health, safety, the welfare, and the common necessities of the community. So again, we have that overlap. And one final point, state laws may not infringe upon federally guaranteed individual constitutional rights that are recognized in the federal constitution. So therefore, if a state legislature adopts a statute that's considered to be contrary to a federal constitutional right, then a person can challenge that statute either in a state court or a federal court, which have the power of judicial review. As previewed, the United States is made up of states, territories, and federal enclaves, and most people live in one of the 50 states or the several territories of the United States. Let's talk about territories. The United States Constitution deals with territories in Section 3, Article 4, which states that, and quote, Congress shall have the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or property belonging to the United States. It should be noted that Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution is titled New States. That's the title of Article 4, New States. So the provision dealing with territories is included in an article that deals with the admission of new states. And as most of us know, the United States started as just 13 states, and it's currently at the number 50, which means that the majority of the current states of the US have become states through the process of admission set up in Article 4. And historically, this has changed, but for the first century of the existence of the United States, the practice was that a territory would eventually become a normal federated state of the US. So New Mexico is currently a state. It started as the territory of New Mexico. So that was the historical practice, that territoriality was meant to be a transition and temporary condition. Because territories are not states of the United States, Congress does have all the police power regarding that territory. So with regards to California, which is a state of the United States, or Florida, or New York, we have the structure I have explained already. The state has the police power, and the federal government can only regulate on the enumerated powers recognized by the Constitution, most notably the commerce power. But when it comes to territories, there is no state legislature. So therefore, Congress is the state legislature of the territory. It has all the inherent general, legislative, or police powers. So Congress can pass a law about Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands or Guam that it could not pass with regard to California, New York, or Florida. Territories of the United States do not possess any inherent legislative power. By definition, any and all legislative power a territorial parliament exercises, by definition, is the result of a statutory delegation made by the federal Congress. Again, as we saw, the territorial condition historically under the practice of the United States was meant to be both temporary, while the territory continued its development to be more organized politically. So therefore, it could begin its process of becoming a federated state of the Union. It was meant to be temporary and transitional. That changed between 1898 and 1901 as a result of the Spanish-American War, where the United States acquired many territories that were not attached to the continental United States, more particularly islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And the U.S. Supreme Court, which is the constitutional court of the United States, which has the ultimate word in the interpretation of that country's constitution, suddenly in 1901 decided that, lo and behold, there were two types of territories under Article 4. One were the so-called incorporated territories, and that's the historical definition. These are territories that are considerably populated, they are organized politically, and they are on their way. And when we say statehood, we mean the creation of a state of the United States, not independence. The integration of that territory to become a federated states. And therefore, an incorporated territory is normally temporary and transitional, and the United States Constitution applies full force. But now, in 1901, the U.S. Supreme Court discovered that the second type of territory, which is called the unincorporated territory. And these territories have not begun the transition to become a state and may never begin that transition to be a state. It can be a permanent condition to be an unincorporated territory of the United States. And according to current US law, they belong to, but are not a part of the United States. And the United States Constitution does not apply full force. With one little unpopulated island in the Pacific, all current territories of the United States are of the unincorporated variant. They do not vote for president because only states can do so. They don't have voting representation in Congress because only states can do so. As a general matter, all federal laws applies, as happens with all other US states, and Congress possesses the full 100% of the general legislative power. Yet, as a historical matter, Congress has delegated considerable legislative power to territorial institutions. But because it is delegated, it's not inherent, like with states. As a result, even though Congress can delegate power, it can always take it back, unlike what can be done with a state. A state power is inherent and cannot be altered by the US Congress. So what about Puerto Rico? So since 1898, as a result of the Treaty of Paris that ended the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico has been an unincorporated territory of the United States. And therefore, any and all legislative powers that is currently exercised by Puerto Rican institutions is a result of a reversible delegation by Congress. Quickly, if you're not familiar with it, Puerto Rico has a long historical process in terms of what is Puerto Rico. Obviously, it includes the settlement by the Spanish in the late 16th century, and is a combination of the native population, African slaves that were imported during the Spanish rule, transplanted Spaniards, and other immigrant populations that have contributed to the Puerto Rican identity. During the 400 years of Spanish rule, there was very little autonomy, very little proto-democratic processes. We were mostly governed by appointed royal governors and very little autonomous institutions. As previewed, then came the Spanish-American War, the United States invasion as part of that war in July of 1898, and the Treaty of Paris, by which Spain ceded sovereignty over the island to the United States. From 1898 to 1900, the island was ruled directly by military authorities, admirals and generals of the US Army and Navy that ruled through military decree. In 1900, the US Congress passed the Four-Acre Act, which created a civilian government of Puerto Rico. And the current government is not the same as the one created in 1900, but it is the same. It's the successor. Each one has succeeded the other one. So the original civilian government was the creation of a federal statute, of a federal law. It was not a constitutional creation. In 1917, the United States passed a second organic statute that expanded local home rule and democratic participation and gave Puerto Ricans US citizenship. Then came the 1950-1952 constitutional process, which is the most relevant today because of international pressure as part of the decolonization movement of after the Second World War, and a generalized consensus in Puerto Rico of dissatisfaction with the then current arrangement. Congress adopted a third act called Act 600, which authorized Puerto Ricans to write a constitution, a charter, for its territorial government to be adopted, quote, in the nation of a compact. I should stress that that compact that resulted in the creation of the 1952 charter was not a treaty. It did not amend the US Constitution. It is not considered a bilateral agreement. The in the nature of a compact language merely meant that it was up to the Puerto Rican people to accept Congress's offer to delegate some of its powers to enhance local home rule. So Puerto Ricans accepted the offer by Congress and elected a constitutional convention that met for a year and a half. It drafted what's called the 1952 Constitution, a charter for local government. It was put to popular referenda, but the US Congress retained the ultimate authority to revise, modify, and it did modify, and eventually approve the charter adopted in 1952. I should stress that the 1952 Constitution did not alter Puerto Rico's condition as an unincorporated territory of the United States. It's the same situation as in 1898. Now, through Public Act 600 and the adoption of the 1952 Constitution, Congress did in fact delegate a considerable portion of legislative power to Puerto Rican institutions. And since 1952, the Puerto Rican Legislative Assembly has exercised legislative power very similar, almost identical to the legislative power that California, New York, or Florida exercise. The difference is the source of that power. California has that power inherently as a state of the United States. Puerto Rico has it as the result of congressional delegation. So even though we adopted a constitution in 1952, Congress still has the power to modify the scope of that delegation of legislative power. So it can give more power, but it can always take power back, as well as the actual structure of the Puerto Rican government can be altered unilaterally by Congress. Now, for almost 60 years, more than 60 years, the Puerto Rican legislature exercised general police power because of that congressional delegation in 1952 and adopted a substantial body of local laws, whether family relations, labor, environment, traffic, whatever you want to call it, everything as a general police power that we described previously. I should be noted quickly that Puerto Rico has a bicameral legislature, mostly made up of first past the post members. It has a tripartite structure because it has an independent executive and an independent judiciary that has the power of judicial review to strike down legislation that is inconsistent with the 1952 Constitution. Puerto Rico does not have senators or congressmen at the federal level. It only has a non-voting single delegate called a resident commissioner. But we have been citizens of the United States since 1917. So that means that if a Puerto Rican moves to the United States, they can function completely as a citizen in that state. But if a person from California moves to Puerto Rico, they will have, they are subject to the situation of the territory, not the individual citizenship. As a result of the 52 process, Puerto Rico was removed from the list of territories that had not achieved self-government in the United Nations, but Puerto Rico is still in the yearly agenda of the UN Decolonization Committee's discussions. Now, I want to focus in my remaining time on a particular situation that happened in 2016 that completely transformed the way we look at the Puerto Rico's exercise of legislative power. Because of a fiscal crisis and the possibility that the entire government would go into bankruptcy, Congress adopted what's called the Promesa statute that could not be adopted with regard to a federated state, could only be done under the territorial clause because Congress has plenary power over the territories. And what Congress did, it created a fiscal oversight board that had the power to override the decisions made by Puerto Rican institutions, including the legislature. The fiscal board is not elected by Puerto Ricans. It was appointed by the President of the United States and congressional leaders. So Promesa constitutes a direct and substantial intervention by the federal Congress with Puerto Rico's legislative powers without Puerto Rican assent. First, it created a board that has a veto power over Puerto Rican legislation. But the thing is that the board is nowhere mentioned in 1952 charter. It was not created by Puerto Rican law. So we are dealing with a situation where a federal law has effectively amended the Puerto Rican local charter without the assent of the Puerto Rican people. And second of all, that board has substantial legislative power because it can veto a decision or a law passed by the Legislative Assembly if it contradicts the board's view of the fiscal policy. It's supposed to be limited to fiscal policy, but that is a very broad subject anyways, because the board has the power to adopt Puerto Rico's budget, has the power to adopt a fiscal plan, and to veto local statutes that are in conflict with that plan. I should stress that the board does not possess all legislative powers. Puerto Rican Legislative Assembly still exercises power over non-budgetary issues, but obviously that's unclear, and it's the subject of a lot of judicial litigation. What are the lessons here? Well, Promesa, which has significantly altered Puerto Rico's ability to exercise legislative power over local matters, means two things. One, that the 1952 settlement was not really a settlement because the US Congress reserved the power to unilaterally intervene in Puerto Rican affairs, in the structure of the Puerto Rican government, and even in the content of Puerto Rican laws and the exercise of the legislative power, and without the assent of the Puerto Rican people. So this can never be done with a US state. So in that sense, Puerto Rico cannot be a model in terms of the settling of this type of situation. We remain an unincorporated territory of the United States. Our relationship with the United States is inherently volatile and problematic because we are subject to unilateral action by the US Congress without the assent of the Puerto Rican people or its representatives. And Congress has exercised the power to unilaterally reduce Puerto Rico's legislative authority over local matters, which means that because of that experience, Puerto Rico should not be a model. Quick mentions that in terms of the contrast with the initiative for the Sahara region, first, that in the United States, as we saw, there is no sharp divide between federal competencies and local competencies because there's a substantial area of overlapping where harmony is presumed. In the initiative, we see the idea of a more clearly defined division of competencies. And from my reading of the type of competencies that would be exercised by the autonomous parliament, they seem in harmony with the notion of the general police power, which is the power to legislate over local matters of everyday concern for the community. And also, like the United States Constitution, it does state that local legislation must be compatible with the nation's constitution, which is in the US parlance is called the Supremacy Clause, and I see that's very similar in the initiative. Unlike what happened in Puerto Rico, there is a recognition of the importance of the role of the United Nations and the principle of self-determination, which was not present in the 1952 process. What we do have in common is that the 1952 process did include important democratic mechanisms for popular intervention in the drafting of the charter, which I see is also mentioned in the initiative. But something that I think is very important from the initiative that Puerto Rico does not have and has been very conscientious is that, as we saw, the US Congress can make unilateral modifications to the settlement, to the arrangement without the assent of Puerto Rico. That does not seem to be the situation in the initiative. And there's a commitment to legally entrench the arrangement in the constitutional structure, which did not happen with Puerto Rico. So in that sense, Puerto Rico is actually still in a process of trying to come to a settlement that would be acceptable to all the parties, and that's currently even being debated right now in the US Congress in terms of the alternatives open to Puerto Rico, which could be integration as a federated state, the 51st state of the United States, to become an independent country, or to find some different arrangement of association that is sorry for the repetition, different from the current arrangement, which is considered insufficient by all parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George, again, for this very comprehensive oversight and description of again, another type of complex system of distribution of power between state legislature, US Congress, delegation of powers to territory. And also thank you for your comparison with the Moroccan initiative for Sahara. Last but not least, we'll talk about yet another island or archipelago, the island of Rodriguez, which is part of Mauritius. And we're pleased to welcome Marie-Valérie Houpiat to address this case study.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fino, and thank you everyone for being present today. I'm really sorry, I have a cold at the moment, so I'm really sorry if my voice shakes a bit. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see the screen? Is it fine? Okay, thank you. So I'm Valerie, and I'm going to make this presentation on the autonomy of Rodriguez and how Rodriguez as an autonomous state of Mauritius functions, and I'm going to make some comparison with the Moroccan initiative. So this is a brief overview of the presentation. So the introduction, I would like to talk about these two concepts of international law, which are self-determination and autonomy. Dive you into having a look at Rodriguez autonomy. We're going to have a look again at the Moroccan initiative and the importance of devolution of legislative powers, and then some lessons to be learned from the Rodriguez experience. So as an introduction, that we know that the 20th century has witnessed a change in the status of countries. Many countries moved from being a colony to become independent. And this independence has brought forward various socioeconomic and cultural changes in the life of countries. So along with independence, another action taken by some states was to become autonomous. So the term which I'll be going to use throughout the presentation will be political autonomy. So political autonomy occurs when a territory within a particular state becomes self-governing. This means that the autonomous state has the capacity to take decisions which are tailor-made for the specific needs of the country. And also, having an autonomous status means that the territory is not under the full control of a main government. So in Mauritius, an example of an autonomous territory, in the Indian Ocean, an example of an autonomous territory is Rodrigues Island. In 2002, Rodrigues gained its independence from Mauritius. And when Rodrigues got its autonomy, I'm sorry if I said independence, but if Rodrigues got its autonomy from Mauritius, it devised its own system of governance. So in Rodrigues, they have the legislative system, their own executive, and their own legislative branch. So this is a bit of the main elements of the presentation. So as I've told you, we're going to look at the principle of self-determination, the autonomy of Rodrigues, the Moroccan initiative, and some recommendation and conclusion. So what are those two concepts of international law, self-determination and autonomy, and why are they important in the context of the Moroccan initiative? So self-determination has for the first time, it was mentioned in the UN Charter of 1945, and then two additional covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So these two covenants provided for the definition of self-determination. So self-determination, as per the two covenants, means all people have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. So through the definition of self-determination provided by the covenants, two important elements have to be highlighted. First, the choice of political status, and secondly, liberty to determine one's economic, social, and cultural development. So what is the choice of political status and how does it work? So people freely choosing their political status involves two things. First, as you can see here, so the choice of how the state would be, either independent or autonomous, and secondly, political territorial integrity. So when we talk about the status of the state, so through national consultation or referendum, people can choose the status of their countries. And I've provided two examples here. So the latest country to have gained independence is South Sudan. In 2011, so after a referendum, the people of South Sudan voted to become an independent state, thus separating them from Sudan. In other cases, people can choose to become autonomous. And that was the case of the Sidama ethnic group in Ethiopia, which after a referendum again in 2019, decided to have their own self-governing system within the state of Ethiopia. So as part of self-determination, this is an important aspect whereby the people choose their own way to govern themselves, either through independence or through autonomy. Another important feature of self-determination is territorial integrity. Territorial integrity and defining borders and territory, we know that since time immemorial, that has caused a lot of conflict between countries. Currently, we know that the Kashmir region in India, next to India, between India and Pakistan, is still the source of conflict. But international law has provided for this particular principle, utis possidetis juris, which means that along with giving people, the choice of becoming either independent or autonomous, the principle provides that we use the territory, we determine the boundaries of a particular territory. So we use it as it was during the period that it was not independent or not autonomous. So the same borders, period prior to independence, autonomy should be used. We know that still this way of defining a territory might still cause some issues here and there, but since we're in the context of international law, there are various ways to solve a dispute instead of taking military or any other form of violent action. So these are the two aspects of political status. So first, political status, whether the country wants to become independent or autonomous, and then define the territory. Another important aspect of this concept of self-determination is the liberty to choose one's own economic, social, and cultural development. So here we have to make reference to the Declaration to the Right to Development, where it is emphasized that the right to development means that the people have the full right over their own natural wealth and resources. So the right to development is being described as an inalienable human rights, and every member of the country has the right to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, and cultural development. So what we can say about the right to development is that it supports self-determination of the people, as it makes it a right for the people to participate and contribute to the economic, as I've said, social and cultural development of the autonomous state. Now, I move to this concept of autonomy. So political autonomy means the capacity of the people of a particular area to determine their own form of government and governance. So this would be outside the power of a central government. And we know, we have seen, and through the discussion we have, many countries now are moving towards becoming autonomous. So an important element of becoming an autonomous state is what is known as the constitutional entrenchment, meaning that if a group of people or a particular territory wishes to become independent, to become autonomous, it has to be recognized by the constitution of the state, of the main state. And what I've, during my research, I came across the case of Ethiopia. Actually, Ethiopia is a very good reference in the African context, whereby in the constitution of Ethiopia at Article 39, it clearly provides the rights of people to create their own autonomous state. So I would say Ethiopia in the African region is a reference for that. So as I've told you, Article 39 of the Ethiopian constitution provide for the right of nationalities and people to create their own territory, to self-govern their own territory and states. So if we look at this concept of autonomy, so it has its own set of strengths and weaknesses. So strength in the sense that people of a particular region can self-regulate. So self-regulate means that they can make laws which are tailor-made for their specific needs, laws which are applicable to them. And speaking under the correction of George, I make reference here to some Indian Reserve Territory in Canada and the US, whereby some laws are applicable or not applicable to those reserved autonomous territories, but are applicable to other provinces, other areas of the provinces. Then we have preservation of culture and tradition. So political autonomy enhances the preservation of culture and tradition. So many minority groups or indigenous groups have the ability to enact legislations or take the necessary measures to preserve their tradition and culture. Example include the Basque and Catalan region in Spain, whereby those regions have really devised law to protect their cultural and linguistic specificities. Another positive aspect of autonomy is the ability to be a compromise between the creation of a separate state and staying as an integral part of a unitary state. So autonomy allows groups to have their own identities and make rules and laws that would benefit their intrinsic characteristics. Some of the challenges and weaknesses of autonomy. So some nationalists, so those who are against autonomy, are of the view that autonomy can be a threat to national security and territorial unity. And another I would say, weakness of autonomy, which is put forward by a nationalist, or that autonomy can be an additional cost for the central government of a country. But I would say that despite those weaknesses and challenges, seeking autonomy can be a success story for many countries. And this leads me to now talk about Rodrigues, how Rodrigues actually is enjoying its autonomous status as part of the Republic of Mauritius. So a little background of Rodrigues. So Rodrigues is a volcanic island, 650 kilometers off the coast of Mauritius, the capital being Port Mathurin. And the main sources of income for the country are fishing, tourism, and agriculture. And as per section 111 of the Mauritian Constitution, Rodrigues forms part of the Republic of Mauritius. So this is the road leading, the steps taken by Rodrigues leading to its autonomy. So in 1968, Mauritius got its independence from the British. And as soon as Mauritius gained its independence, there were, parallel to that, there were discussions in Rodrigues as to what status would Rodrigues want. And many Rodriguans, after consultation with NGOs and the people, so many people in Rodrigues wanted to become autonomous, not independent from Mauritius, but autonomous, being able to manage their own activities in Rodrigues. So 1968, Mauritius got its independence. Then in 1976, as Mauritius was, really becoming a democratic state and getting all its institutions set up properly. So in 1976, a Ministry of Rodrigues was created, and the purpose of the Ministry of Rodrigues was to look after and manage the internal affairs of Rodrigues. And for the first time, Mr. Serge Clair, a Rodriguan citizen, became the Minister of Rodrigues. So before that, it was Mr. Serge Clair became the Minister of Rodrigues in 1982. So from 1976 up to 1982, it was a Mauritian citizen who was the minister from Rodrigues. And then in 1982, it was the first time that a Rodriguan citizen became the Minister of Rodrigues. And therefore, from 1976 up to early 2000, so discussions were done with the Rodriguans as to how they want their autonomy. And an interesting situation was that in 2000, in order to gain knowledge about how autonomy works, what are the steps undertaken by other countries, so a delegation from Mauritius went to Trinidad and Tobago to see how to be a form of an autonomous state from Trinidad. So the purpose of the trip was to examine how Tobago was able to self-rule and administer their local affairs. And the aim of it was mainly to learn the Tobagonian experience, some of the steps
Hello, Dr. Valérie. I think we're losing you. Can we check the connection again with you? Dr. Marc Finot, we're trying to reach Dr. Upia in a second.
Yes, sorry for this interruption. Unfortunately, this happens We're all dependent on technology. In the meantime, in case you haven't noticed, Majda has shared in the chat 3 of the presentations. I shared my introduction, but as we said, the complete papers will be made public shortly and made available on our website.
I think Dr. Upia is back. Let me check her microphone and camera.
Yes. Welcome back, Valerie. Back to you.
Unfortunately, we cannot hear you. Can you try again to say something?
Valerie, can you unmute yourself? Still have connection problems with Valerie. Valerie, can you speak up? No, sorry. Unfortunately, we have lost the connection. Sorry. I'm afraid we'll have to cut short your presentation. Again, we shared your presentation so everyone can already have an idea of its content. But unfortunately, because of the time pressure, we won't be able to try again. So with our apologies for this interruption, let me try now to give some conclusions to our discussion. I think you have understood, of course, the differences in each particular case due to the historical processes that led to autonomous regions, sometimes with ups and downs, back and forth. We have seen that in the case of Puerto Rico, and Karin David talked about the yo-yo system with the different types of status, more or less generous in terms of devolution of legislative powers. In all cases, as the principle of autonomy is concerned, there are a number of key competencies that the central state or the federal state keeps for itself, such as defense, foreign affairs, currency. But then there is a sort of gray zone where some competencies that are presumably traditionally exercised by central state can be delegated to autonomous regions. It was also interesting to compare the differences of the electoral systems for the election of the regional parliament. Some are more based on proportional representation. Depends also, of course, on the size of the legislative body. the duration of the term of MPs. But in most cases, the executive, the regional executive is elected by parliament. With the additional case of New Caledonia, where it's not only the head of the executive, but it's all the members of the executive who are elected on the basis of proportional representation, which is a good system to allow to force actually the members between majority and minority or opposition to compromise, to negotiate on common decisions. Obviously, we looked at a series of cases in island states or regions, which is different from the case of Moroccan Sahara, because it's part of a continental and unitary state. And this is where you have this whole range of degrees of autonomy, including decentralized unitary states up to a very decentralized federal state like the United States. And that, of course, has many consequences, especially on the control that the central state can keep over the autonomous region, which can be a purely constitutional control a posteriori in the case of Canary Islands, or with the resort to the constitutional court, like in New Caledonia. And sometimes there may be conflict of competencies, and sometimes it's important to have procedures precisely to solve such conflict. As we have seen, this can happen even in a federal state like the United States. And there can be also cases of overlap or executive or exclusive powers. Of course, the electoral system also can include the definition of the electorates, and that's the case with New Caledonia because of the colonial history and the need to avoid an influx of new settlers that could unsettle the balance between the populations. Also interesting, in some cases, the legislative power is also extended to executive power, which again, in the case of New Caledonia, the Congress, Parliament can also adopt executive acts, which are normally the prerogative of the executive government. And then you have also difference between state or regional parliaments, which can be bicameral or with a single chamber. And bicameralism, as we have seen in the case of New Caledonia, can also help with this balance between powers, and it can give some prerogative to the native populations to preserve their own custom, their own culture, their own traditions. It was actually very interesting, even fascinating to learn more about the US and the Puerto Rican system, where you have a sort of a paradox that the US Congress, the federal Congress, actually receives delegation of power from the state legislatures. But in the case of the territory, such as Puerto Rico, it's the US Congress that delegates its own powers to the autonomous region. Finally, as actually clearly described by Valerie in the case of Rodriguez, and this was actually confirmed by previous seminars, it's important to note that the concept of self-determination is perfectly compatible with the system of autonomy. And it can be exercised. The self-determination which is an international right based on international law, can be exercised fully through a system of autonomy with democratic mechanisms and can be changed only with the agreement of the people from the autonomous regions, as provided for in the Moroccan initiative, like pointed out by George, which is a major difference with the system of Puerto Rico. So these are, just a few remarks, and we still have maybe a few minutes left if there are any questions, particularly to clarify some points addressed to one of the speakers. So you could raise your hand in the raise hand icon. So we don't seem to have any particular questions, just comments and thanks. So I will just, of course, join my own thanks. We will, of course, share all the presentations, share the articles, and again, they will be made public shortly on our website and in hard copies. Does Ambassador Hilal wish to make any comments? No comments, just thanks. Thank you all. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to the people who attended, and I take this opportunity to salute, to pay tribute to some members of our academic network who took part in this webinar. And if you're interested, you can look up their past contributions to past seminars on Philippines, on Greenland, on Spanish provinces, and a few other cases. So thank you so much again, and I hope we can meet again soon, either in person, hopefully, or again virtually soon, to address other aspects of autonomous regimes and their contribution to solving conflicts and helping regions to apply their own self-governance. Thank you so much. Hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for the invitation.